Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, I'm joined by Paul D.B. Watkins, professor of English at Vancouver Island University. Paul is the author of Soundin, Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, a uniquely researched and presented monograph that, while distinguishing aesthetics from rhetoric, traces a line from Black Canadian poetry through music to describe Black Canadian life, experience, and citizenship. A DJ himself, Paul mirrors the remixing and sampling methods used by musicians to enhance his research with samples of poetry, literature, interviews, and cultural elements, and even an accompanying playlist, to more deeply portray Black life in Canada. The title is published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this final episode of this 4-part series, Paul talks about the design of his book and how its layout and physical presentation facilitate and support the concepts it covers. So your book is accompanied by an in-depth website, including playlists for the book, chapters, remixes of the songs discussed in the book, and audio files for readers to create their own remixes. Was there always a plan to include that website with the book? Did this help address the challenges of writing a book about music and poetry that's meant to be heard as well?
I hope so. One of the challenges I faced early on was the limits of the printed page, right? When you're talking about music, a book sounds in a sense that, the reader is making it sound in their own head. So I extended the project through the website. So www.soundincanaan.com, which features audio and transcripts of poet interviews, a number of the interviews that I conducted myself, including, one with Wade Compton. That's a new one that I did at the Victoria book launch. There's resources mentioned in the book. There's discussion questions. There's newly added material. And there you also find the playlist, right? So, there's the original playlist on Spotify. There's now a YouTube playlist as well, so you can get the material that way. There's remixed audio, additional news and media. So remix is a big part of the book. So, that was one of the things, I tried to do when presenting the material at, the book launches that I have done. So, I wanted to perform the work in a way that embodied what I was writing about. So that meant remixing my own prose into poetic form, sampling from interviews, and mixing audio live on the spot. So those performances, along with the audio, are also archived on the website. So, since the book employs a DJ methodology, right, mixing poetry, theory, music, other forms into a literary sonic mix, I wanted to carry that approach into the readings themselves, right? Again, to foreground the power of Black voice in song. And in my experience, right, if you've ever been to scholarly book launches, right, they typically involve, a short excerpt followed by a signing. But I really wanted to remix and, defamiliarize that format, even the spaces I was reading in, having opening acts, right, inviting some of the poets. Wade Compton did a reading, and then we did an interview together at the Victoria book launch. And so I hope these performances are an effective way to sound some of the book's key ideas mixed and mashed right into these 20-minute performances. And most of the tracks sample directly from the music also discussed by the poets, and sample the poets themselves. And I mean, the easier thing would have been for me just to get up there and read from the prelude or something like that. So this was much more difficult. I've got actual decisions to make, and hopefully the performances and the website, right, continue to evolve in different ways. It sort of keeps the book open as something living and not static.
Yeah, no, I feel like it does. I mean, how could you not? I mean, it's such a natural extension of the book. It's so cool.
Thank you.
So I know we're kind of talking, we're in a podcast, it's not a visual media, but I'm wondering if you could the design of the book itself is really important. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through that. What are some of the design elements that make it different from a typical monograph?
Yeah, so Wilfrid Laurier University Press did a really wonderful job. There were some challenges, right, trying to just make this book happen. Even like just getting, when I realized I had to get like permission for song lyrics, I was like, there's a lot of song lyrics in this book. I guess I'm going to be sending, lots and lots of emails. But senior editor Siobhan McMenemy and all other folks at the press were really encouraging and helping the vision of this book come to life, right? So the book includes the names of artists in the margins. So the idea is when you're reading the book, you're going through it, you see an artist's name, that connects into a playlist. So you can actually go and then listen to that music if you want. I think you can appreciate the playlist sort of on its own as well as a kind of sampling into a genre or an era. There's also liner notes, which is sort of just rebranded footnotes in a way, but they function a little bit differently, like in relation to the end notes that you get at the end of the book. And there's also QR codes, right, at the beginning of each chapter as a way that link directly into the playlist. As I mentioned, the website also includes YouTube versions of those. And, maybe I'll include one for Apple Music or something like that, is so that you can get depending, which streaming service you're using, you can get access that way. And so I think it allows for the reader of the book, hopefully, also to feel a little bit like a kind of DJ themselves, right? So I wanted to feel active, right, rather than just like a passive reading experience, right? There's also these conversations that are happening in the end notes. So yeah, hopefully the reader feels a little bit like a kind of DJ. And if I were to do it again, maybe in a future book, I would try to push these things maybe even further.
Oh, really? Like in what way? Like, do you have any ideas of how that might happen?
Maybe I could do more, visually or poetically, maybe interesting in terms of style and academic language. Marshall McLuhan, wrote a book quite a long time ago in media studies where he talks about the medium is the massage, and that book's really innovative just in the way it plays with style and remix. There's a book by DJ Spooky, Paul D. Miller, called Rhythm Science. That's sort of about DJing, and he connects it to literary intertextuality and all these things. And the format of the book itself is like a remix of that. So, I've thought about these things, but certainly, that creates even a further level of extraction for a work that's this kind of rigor. But, maybe in the future, I have some ideas. We'll see.
Yeah. Excellent. Cool. So you mentioned the playlists that are related to the chapter, or that are, in the chapters. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How do you imagine readers relating that music to the narrative? I mean, can you talk about how purposeful and intentional you were in sort of selecting, the songs or the music or that you talk about in those chapters?
Sure. The playlists, they follow the chapters, so they sort of function as a kind of unfolding sonic counterpoint to the book. So each chapter of Soundin Canaan opens with a particular listening, and then it's followed by a short history of a musical genre. Okay. So this approach is meant to give readers who may not be familiar with a particular music a grounding in how these sounds are then taken and transformed by the poets. So the tracks connect directly to the playlists, which can also be enjoyed, like I said, on their own terms. And this also fits within the very structure of the book. So the structure of Soundin Canaan progresses from analog to digital, right? Moving through blues, jazz, dub, hip hop, and culminating in DJing and remix. For example, the chapter on George Eliot Clarke and Dion Brand begins with blues before turning to jazz. And in Brand's case, I open with a listening. So just to take like one of those listenings of John Coltrane's Venus from interstellar space. And nowhere in Coltrane's work is cosmology more present than here. It's a track which is Coltrane and the drummer, Rashid Ali, and it becomes a kind of dialogue. It's intimate yet fast. It's kind of folksy. And Dion Brand spends a lot of time, talking about this particular song, for example, in, two of the book collections I looked, the two long poems, Ossuaries and The Blue Clerk. And so actually going in and listening to this piece, right, making space for it, devoting some time to my own listening, I feel is like an entryway into the text. It was for me, and so I want to share that love for the reader as well. I wrote this book listening to. I have a huge vinyl collection. Probably about 3,000 pieces of vinyl. And so I remember actually, talking with Dion Brand in Toronto about this, and finding this in a record shop in Toronto, that record Interstellar Space, and bringing it home and listening to it and sort of writing part of the book to it. So it's like built into the very process of actually creating the book. And I actually think it's essential, right, to hear the music in order to get a sense of how Brand engages with space and sound in her poetry. Chapter 3 then considers Bessie Phillip in relation to dub, right, chant and reggae. Chapter 4 looks at Canaan and hip hop. The final full chapter turns to Wade Compton and the practices of DJing and remix, sort of bringing things full circle. So readers are invited to not just listen, but to hear, right, and feel the revolutionary potential of Black music and creativity. And I hope that comes through in the playlist.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So I'm curious. I feel like, obviously the artists that you've written about in your book, they're combining the rhetorical and the aesthetic in intentional ways. And I'm wondering why you might think, some genres or artists seem more adept at channeling, that duality than others. I'm thinking of, for example, some mainstream pop musicians. And how you might interpret, the tension between major music stars who often are reticent to sound overly political, and even while their audience is maybe looking to them to weigh in on certain social or political issues because they have this huge platform. To be fair, there are some mainstream musicians who do that really well. Others don't. Others may feel like that's not my job. I'm here to entertain. But I'm just curious, what are your thoughts around that sort of dynamic, where especially nowadays, people are really looking towards people with a large platform to take a position on things?
It's a good question. Could go on for a while, but I'll try to sort of curtail my response. I mean, at its core, music is political, right?
Yeah.
Even when it chooses not to be, right? Or I should say, musicians are political, right? The format of music can be as well. Silence says something, right? It opens you up, obviously, to criticism. Listeners always have a right, to demand more, I think, of their artists, particularly in the very challenging times we find ourselves in, to put it lightly.
Right.
Of course, not every song needs to deliver a message, right? I think sometimes the very form of the music, the aesthetic, can carry a political message. But I really appreciate when artists use their voice, right, to push boundaries. But I also value music simply as sound, right? It can have different kinds of functions. Ultimately, it connects people, which I think is meaningful. One album I've been drawn to recently is Michelle and de Gaycello's Grammy-winning album, No More Water, The Gospel of James Baldwin. I don't know if people are familiar with that album, but it channels a multiplicity of voices, sounds, utterances, resistance, both in honor and in dialogue with James Baldwin's words and legacy. At times it's choral and collective in its sounding of love and hope, and other times it's singular in its focus, and it's full of righteous anger, right? So it's the kind of album that demands attentioning and deep listening and response. It's not something like that's ideal perhaps for easy radio consumption. It doesn't need to be, right? It's serving its purpose as it's intended. I think everyone should read Baldwin, though. Everyone should go listen to this album. I admire groups, though, that sort of straddle those boundaries as well. Take Irish language rap group Kneecap, who've been in the media a lot lately, right, for their use of music to raise awareness, not only about the Irish language and British imperialism, but also about Palestine, right? A mainstream artist like Sinead O'Connor did this too, right? So, there are examples, I think, of, popular artists doing this. Macklemore's another one. So music can help move the needle, I think, of change a little closer to justice. Of course, music and poetry, for all the power I give them, on their own, they can't stop genocide or fascism, but they can provide a sonic blueprint for resistance and community, right? Poetry, it can help us resist numbness. It's an antidote to apathy, right? It can be a catalyst for change, most idealistically. And, one of the soundings, listenings I bring in at the end of the book is Sam Cooke's "A Change is Going to Come." And, he reminded us, and I think we still need to believe that a change is going to come. Because if you look around, right, the world is in really rough shape, right? Or rather, the people who control the world, they're not doing a very good job. And so poetry and music can help wake us up.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Paul. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
You just heard from Paul D.B. Watkins. Paul is a professor of English at Vancouver Island University and the author of Soundin, Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, available now through Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Remember, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by a small but extraordinary team, including Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, and digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.